ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
It is the government's belief that the Australian Olympic Committee, our Olympic athletes and our people will fully understand its reluctance to propose such a serious course. But it is quite satisfied that in the event of the continued occupation of Afghanistan by the USSR, an effective boycott of the Games will bring home to the Russian government and people, perhaps in a way that no other step could, the great seriousness in the eyes of independent nations of the steps the USSR has taken.
That is the then Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser calling on Australia's Olympians to skip the 1980 Moscow Games. Why? It was deep in the Cold War, and the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and the USA boycotted the Olympics in response. Fraser wanted us to follow suit. You might have heard a familiar complaint about mixing sport and politics. In 1980, the two were heavily intertwined. In the face of financial pressure, public shaming, death threats, 121 Australians competed in Moscow anyway. Many returned not to ticker tape parades or TV specials, but silence. 4 decades on, and the wrongs are about to be acknowledged in Australian Parliament. Today, the somewhat forgotten story of our scorned Olympians. I'm Patrick Stack. This is ABC Sport Daily. Today you're going to hear two voices, 1980 swimming Olympic gold medalist Michelle Ford and 1980 marathoner Rob de Castella, who will explain this incredible story. Michelle, if you cast your mind back, can you explain to us what was the situation leading into the Moscow Olympic Games?
It was quite abrupt in many ways. When the American president called for a boycott, it sent a shockwave through the world, and the Australian government followed that lead and asked that the athletes not go to the Games.
There will be an effective boycott, yes, there's no doubt about that. I've always believed it, but I've now been given the specific dates and timing of the official advice from the German government to the Olympic Committee.
From there, it was a question of whether or not the Australian Olympic Federation of the time would vote in favour of going to the Games or not, or to boycott. As the Australian Olympic Federation voted to go to the Games, the government put it on a campaign, a very negative campaign through the media to stop us from going.
And the Australian team here, by a vote, only one vote by the Australian Federation, the Olympic Federation, voting 6-5 to come here, and the trip was in doubt the whole time.
The government would be calling up each and individual and our sporting federations, really offering bribes not to go. Some federations took that money, $500,000, which was a lot of money back then. And for athletes, it was $6,000. All the athletes who decided not to go was given a pat on the back, a thank you letter from the government, and also, the financial reward for not going. Now, we have to remember that the Australian government was still trading with the USSR, wheat, bauxite, other minerals, and they were asking the Australian athletes not to go. So there was a hypocrisy in their action, but they still continued to push for the fact that we should not go. We were being treated as traitors. We were given death threats. We were nearly banished from this country.
We were adamant that we were going to run regardless, sort of even if we had to run under the Olympic flag or, just in a white singlet.
And behind them, the Australian team carrying the Olympic flag. The Australian team marching behind the placard Australia, and I can see now the Olympic flag being carried jointly by Denise Boyd and Max Metzger.
The whole principle of manipulating and using vulnerable athletes and sport as a political tool to make a statement was just something that was abhorrent, and we were just adamant that we weren't going to be part of that process.
I understand to get to the Games, you had to essentially sneak out of Australia, the very country you were going to represent on the world stage. Michelle, what was that like?
It was quite ironic. We weren't planned to leave yet, but 2 days prior we were told that we had to pack up our bags, not tell anyone, and get to the airport without our blazers on and travel to an unknown location in Europe to continue our training.
So you both arrive in Moscow. Rob, you're 23. It's your first Olympic Games. Michelle, you're just 17. You turn 18 while you are there, and you're competing against the might of East Germany at the height of some of their most gross doping indiscretions. You go on to win gold in the 800 freestyle, a bronze in the 200 fly. What were your experiences like in Moscow?
The event at the 800 metres freestyle, at lunchtime, I opened my fan mail, that was sent, and I get a letter saying that if I stand on those blocks to represent, I would be un-Australian and I'd be a traitor. That really touched me. But then when I got to the blocks, I just put everything aside because I had a more challenging program in front of me, and that was the East Germans. I feel not lucky, but so relieved that I was able to beat them, and it was such an extraordinary experience.
Here comes Michelle Ford, the crowd starting to cheer. About 15 metres to go, and Michelle Ford is easily 8 to 10 metres in front. A tremendous effort for Australia, and in comes Michelle Ford with a gold medal in 8:28.9. Great work, Michelle Ford.
I remember the first run that we did running down this dirt footpath, and we were coming towards a bus stop, and there was about, sort of 20 or so Muscovites waiting to hop on the bus. And as we came closer and closer, there was a group of about, 5 or 6 of us out on our first run. These big Muscovites waiting to hop on the bus were all standing there, and we're sort of getting closer and closer and thinking, what's going to happen when we get closer? Then all of a sudden they just parted, and they stood on each side of the path. As we ran through the middle of them, they all clapped and applauded. And this woman jumped out in front of us, and there was a rock in the middle of the path, and she picked up the rock quickly and threw it to the side, and then jumped back and joined the applause as we ran through the middle. Just as we were so proud to host the Sydney Olympics, the people of Moscow and Russia were so proud to be able to host and welcome the world to their country. People are people everywhere, and the politics gives us this perspective and perception that, people are different. But, it made me realise that, everyone in Moscow was just so proud to be able to showcase their city and welcome the world to their country.
If both of you were returning Olympians from the most recent games, you might have been greeted with a ticker tape parade or cheering crowds at the airport, maybe a TV special or two. I doubt you much of a social media presence, but your follows, they're going through the roof. What was life like for you when you returned home from the 1980 Olympic Games?
I remember one, prominent radio journalist down in Melbourne, calling us traitors and saying how we were, sort of competing while the Russians were killing Afghan babies, and, horrible, disgraceful, despicable comments targeting young, talented Australians. And I just found that absolutely abhorrent. I remember a couple of years later, after I set a world record and won the world championship, the same journalist reached out to me while I was overseas and asked for an exclusive interview. And I said, sorry, mate, no, you burnt your bridges. I still remember what you said about us back in 1980, refused to be interviewed by him. So, look, it was a horrible time. It did bring out the worst of elements within our society. I have enormous admiration and respect for the Australian Olympic Committee and all of the respective national sporting organisations, especially Athletics Australia, who stood their ground and said that, we will not be manipulated, we will not be used for political purpose, and made that vote for us to still compete.
We came back from Moscow. There was no celebration. In fact, we were told to be quiet, and each one went into their corners. We couldn't really have that moment of joy and feeling that we've done something extraordinary or special. I felt that when I touched the wall in Moscow, I felt that the country reunited. The country was split in half over whether we should go or not. And I just felt, even though I was thousands of miles away, I felt that the energy of Australia rekindled. It was a special moment.
How did this difficult chapter for Australia, but also the Olympic movement, shape the Olympics in terms of what was to come?
If we can go back to 1980, the Olympic movement was on its knees. It was not going to survive that boycott. If countries like Australia didn't go, because we went to Moscow, there was hope that the Olympic movement could rekindle and move forward. But that was only due when the athletes took the stage and we asked that things change because it wasn't good how it was. There was no professionalism. We were total amateurs. We had no females. We only 23% participation in female sport. Also, we asked for that there was a life ban on doping. We also asked for the politics of sport to try and keep the playing field a sanctuary for the athletes and not for the politics. And by doing that, we were able to sign a declaration of the athletes' right to compete, of which I was privileged to be a signatory to. In 2015, we finally have that now in place, which allows athletes to go to the Olympics if they have the qualifying standards under the Olympic flag.
Next week, you both, along with other Moscow Olympians, will be recognised on the floor of Australian Parliament. What is that going to mean to you both? Is there a sense of healing, for want of a better word?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've just completed my book, Turning the Tide, where I examined what happened in Moscow and why it happened and the effect of it. And the effect was it was so saddening to hear some of the athletes and how they felt. In fact, some of the people who we've contacted say the scars are still too raw to go to Canberra next week. I applaud the government for their action and their acknowledgement of what this team did, because I think this will heal those scars.
It's an important statement, and it's an important acknowledgement that the Prime Minister and the government and Australia is making to acknowledge the mistakes of the past, to acknowledge that the decisions that were made back then were flawed and were wrong. I think some athletes and some sports chose not to go, and I think that they are probably carrying much more regret. So I think, sort of an acknowledgement of the commitment and the dedication of the Olympic team and also those that should have gone but didn't go is a really important gesture and an important statement for the government to make.
Michelle Ford, Rob de Castella, thank you both for sharing your stories with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure.
Headlines. The Wallabies have called in the muscle for the crucial second test against the Lions. Rob Valentini and Will Skelton picked to start for Australia against the British and Irish team at the G Saturday night. Skelton will replace Jeremy Williams, who will move to the bench. Valentini comes in for Nick Champion de Krepnier, who is out of the team altogether. Dave Parecki is another change to the starting side, coming in at hooker in place of Matt Fassler. Coach Joe Schmidt has stuck with the backline that started in Brisbane. Harry Wilson remains Australian captain. Live coverage on the ABC Listen app. Stephen May and Melbourne are appealing the defender's 3-match ban that was dished out for his collision with Francis Evans. May was found guilty of rough conduct at the AFL tribunal. The incident concussed Evans, broke his nose and sent part of his tooth flying. May was concussed in a separate incident, so he can't play this weekend anyway. Therefore, the matter will actually be heard next week. Elsewhere, Riak Andrew, the Swans defender, has been given a 5-game suspension for using a homophobic slur in the Sydney Reserves team. The beautiful game? Do you remember the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup? It ended in controversy, with Spain victorious over England on the field before the now infamous indiscretions of Spanish football boss Luis Rubiales and coach Jorge Vilda. Well, those two nations will meet again in the final of the European Championships after both won through their semi-finals. The final is Monday morning in Switzerland. Yannick Sinner has rehired the man at the centre of his doping case. Umberto Ferrara was let go by the Italian amid the news he had tested positive to a banned substance which the men's world number 1 tennis player claimed entered his system as a consequence of a massage administered by that physio. Now, Ferrara is back on Team Sinner, and Nick Kyrgios says this is evidence we've been played, which is cutting and pithy, but I'm not sure it's entirely relevant. I'm Patrick Stack. This is ABC Sport Daily, produced by Poppy Penny.
Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.